Hello and welcome to the 22nd episode of the Escaping Ideology podcast series, a nonpartisan production of Marion West, where we try to engage in independent thought, critical commentary, and in-depth interviews from across the political and cultural spectrum. I'm your host, Marion West, contributing editor, Jonathan Church. In this episode, I moderate a stimulating and spirited debate between philosophy professor Ben Burgis and economics professor Walter Block on the age-old debate over whether socialism or capitalism offers a better way of life. In this debate, Ben will make the case for democratic socialism, while Walter will make the case for laissez-faire capitalism. Both Ben and Walter have a long history of arguing for their respective positions, and I encourage listeners who may be unfamiliar with their backgrounds to do a basic Google search on them, and that should be sufficient to acquaint listeners with the impressive scope of their public commentary. But with all that in mind, let's launch into the debate.
Welcome to this debate between Ben Burgis and Walter Block. This is a debate that is going to touch upon one of the long-lasting perennial topics of debate in contemporary society, and the topic of economics and philosophy and politics and so on. It's essentially capitalism versus socialism. Ben is going to make the case for democratic socialism, as I understand it, a normative case for socialism as a social system that promotes equality, liberty, and solidarity. But recognizing that, there's varied meanings of capitalism, socialism in the current discourse, will lay out his own case for a particular kind of democratic socialism that he has in mind. Walter will then present a rebuttal to Ben's argument, and at least as I understand it, will argue specifically for laissez-faire capitalism as an alternative to Ben's idea of democratic socialism. So, as I said, socialism or capitalism, as defined by or argued for by our respective and eminent interlocutors. So before we get started, just a brief layout of the format. Ben will have 10 minutes to present his opening argument. Walter will have 10 minutes to present a rebuttal. You don't have to use the whole 10 minutes, and if you don't, presumably we'll have some more time for back and forth, that back and forth is as described below. So after the opening, I expect that there'll be a great urge to respond to each other's openings, so we will give Ben and Walter 5 minutes apiece to respond to their opponent's opening, and then depending how that goes, maybe an additional back and forth of 2 to 3 minutes per person. So we just want to make sure everybody has equal time and that we don't go down a rabbit hole. And then I'll have a question for each of you, one challenging Ben, one challenging Walter, 5 minutes each to respond, and then maybe 2 to 3 minutes per person, depending on the nature of the objection and so on. We'll play it a little bit by ear. Again, equal time, no rabbit holes. And depending on where we stand in terms of time, I may have a second set of questions, but we're going to try to keep this. I suspect it'll go over an hour, but definitely within, less than, say, an hour and a half. And so at that point, we will proceed to the closing argument, 5 minutes apiece. Ben goes first, Walter goes second, same as in the opening. And throughout it all, we will have a time clock to keep track of each other's time, I guess for the benefit of everybody, but in particular Ben and Walter, so they can keep track of where they are in their particular arguments. So with that said, I have it set at 10 minutes, and we will start with Ben, the case for democratic socialism.
All right. Thank you, Walter, for doing this debate. And thank you, Jonathan, for stepping in once again to moderate. When I say that I'm a socialist and I'll be arguing for democratic socialism, I mean two things by that. They're both pretty standard things for people to use those phrases to mean, but it's important to get clear on these distinctions so we don't end up talking past each other. When politicians like Walter's high school classmate Bernie Sanders talk about democratic socialism, they usually seem to be talking about implementing socialist policies within a basically capitalist context. So Medicare for all, for example, is a socialist policy. Basically, you're nationalizing the health insurance industry and providing medical care outside of the market to everyone. Lots of societies that have implemented similar programs are still, capitalist societies, certainly, but we all know what someone means when they call that a socialist policy. And I'm certainly a socialist in that sense. To stick with that example, I think implementing something like Medicare for all is morally urgent. And to the extent that we spend our time here talking about that point, I'm extremely happy to do so. Americans will stay in jobs they hate for fear of losing their employer health insurance. Sometimes they'll even stay in marriages they hate for fear of losing their spousal health insurance. These are things that in practice, in concrete reality, make Americans less free to live our lives how we please than citizens of many other advanced countries. And that's not even to get into the higher rates of mortality amenable to healthcare that you get because of our much more marketized healthcare system. The people who don't have health insurance, who have a spot that could be cancer and could be nothing, but don't get it checked out because they don't want to pay out of pocket. The people who do have health insurance and end up, having a serious issue and spending half their lives on their phone, or the loved ones do, to try to get a human on the phone to reverse a cost-cutting decision that was made by the insurance company's AI, the diabetics who will sometimes die because they're trying to ration out their insulin. These are things that don't happen in the Nordic countries, for example. Most of them don't even happen in Canada, where at least basic health insurance is nationalized, even if there's a market for supplemental coverage. So yeah, I'm very enthusiastically in favor of democratic policies, democratic socialist policies, like that example about Medicare for all. As I said in my first essay, these are the kinds of programs that would make our society that much more civilized, and they would accomplish this by contracting the scope of capitalist property rights, whether by, in that example, nationalizing health insurance, or through redistributing resources through progressive taxation, as is the case for any number of other programs. Similarly, various programs that are already in place, ranging from K-12 public schools to public fire departments that have to put out burning hovels no less than burning mansions, make our society that much more humane and livable. And they too do it by contracting the scope of capitalist property rights. But neither public fire departments nor public health care amount to socialism in the second major sense in which that term is used. And I'm also a socialist in that sense, that I think that the long-term goal of left-wing politics should be to move beyond capitalism to a new kind of economic system. Okay, so what kind of economic system would that be? Well, it's certainly true that some Western socialist intellectuals in the 20th century were apologists for authoritarian regimes like the Soviet Union that called themselves socialist. Like I said in that first essay, I think that was a grievous moral and political error, much as, for example, the leading lights of libertarianism like Hayek and Milton Friedman were making a similar mistake when they engaged in apologetics for former President Augusto Pinochet's reign of terror in Chile after he overthrew the democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende. But there's always been another strand within the socialist tradition that never had any truck with any of that, and that's the one that I would identify with. Socialists, going back to Marx and Engels, objected to capitalism because democracy stopped at the factory gates. They wanted something that was more rather than less democratic than liberal capitalist democracies. And after the Russian Revolution, there were people ranging from, Rosa Luxemburg to Trotsky to Michael Harrington, and I'm casting a very wide net here. These are people who disagree with each other about all sorts of things, but they all agreed that the Soviet model wasn't what they wanted to come after capitalism. They wanted a system where instead of private owners controlling the means of production and running those economic fiefdoms like miniature dictatorships, the means of production were under the control of the workers themselves or the broader community or some combination of the two. And I go into a bit more detail in my essay and and I provide a hyperlink for anyone who's interested in a good article about the logistics of how this could work by a left-wing economics professor, Mike Beggs. For anyone who's interested, it's called "We Can Craft a Workable Workplace Democracy for a Socialist Future." But for now, let me just say that look at the real-life successes of social democracy and the real-life successes of worker cooperatives like Mondragon in Spain. There's every reason to be skeptical when libertarians confidently assert that it would be impossible to have a thriving economy if the working class took over the means of production from the wealthy elites that currently dominate society. I'm sure we'll argue about that pragmatic point tonight, but what I want to focus on in the time I have left is the more basic normative disagreement. Because whether or not it's economically safe to experiment with ways of democratizing workplaces and creating a society that's not divided into a class of owners and a class of workers, that's one question. But a more fundamental question is whether, if it is possible, it would be desirable. And on that more fundamental question, Walter and I fundamentally disagree. I explained my position on the normative question in that first essay in terms of three values that are important to me. These aren't some special socialist values that I made up. They're classical liberal democratic values, the values in the name of which the revolutions were fought centuries ago that brought down the quasi-feudal ancien regime and gave us the modern world of liberal capitalist democracies, which as a socialist, I think was a long step in the right direction, but didn't go far enough. So those values are in the original French, liberté, égalité, fraternité, or roughly freedom, equality, and social solidarity. Equality and solidarity are maybe obvious enough. Under capitalism, everyone is formally legally equal, but some people have hundreds or thousands of times the material resources and hence the economic power over others. You don't have to be an absolutist by saying that everyone always needs to get precisely the same share of the pie, no matter what, to see that this kind of towering, absurd inequality is obscene. And social solidarity means treating absolutely everyone as a member of the community of people that we care about. Not just saying, hey, good luck, but you're on your own. If you end up sleeping on the street or you end up having to work 3 jobs to keep a roof over your head, that's a you problem. But I think the case for socialism from equality and solidarity is relatively straightforward. The most interesting part of all this to me is the part about freedom, because I suspect that Walter is going to base his entire case on that, at least as far as the normative question goes. So let's zero in on the disagreement there in the time we have left. The deontic libertarian theory of freedom is that the most important kind of freedom is freedom from interference. We own ourselves, we own external property, no one has a right to interfere with either one. But there are two very basic problems here. The first is that this is a radically uninformative account of freedom, because it can't say that we have a right to whatever property we actually happen to possess. If it said that, you couldn't even recover stolen property. And it can't say that it's wrong to take away whatever property you have a legal claim to, because if it said that, the principle couldn't be used to resist, redistributive taxation or even nationalization. If we passed a law to nationalize Amazon and turn it over to the workers, and if you want to say that would be unconstitutional, let's say we passed a constitutional amendment and then we did it, then Jeff Bezos's legal rights to that property wouldn't be violated. So what it necessarily means to say that you can't interfere with somebody's property is not that you can't interfere with the property people happen to have, or even the property they're legally entitled to have, but you can't interfere with the property that they're morally entitled to have. But that's the whole issue in dispute. 100% of what the argument about the ethics of redistribution is about is precisely about who's entitled to what property. So that's one issue. I think that freedom from interference is largely a red herring. The other issue is I don't even think it's the most fundamental kind of freedom. I think the most fundamental kind of freedom is freedom from domination. A slave who's whipped every day is more interfered with than one with a kind master, but the second slave isn't more free than the first. And even if it's not as bad as slavery or capital or feudalism, in a capitalist society where most people don't have access to the means of production, so they have no realistic way of supporting themselves except by submitting themselves to the dictates of an unelected boss, we have less of that kind of freedom than we'd have if we extend democracy from politics to economics.
Okay, well done, within the 10-minute time frame. So let me reset the clock to 10 minutes. Okay, Walter, I've reset the clock, and now it is your turn to present the case for, as I understand it, laissez-faire capitalism.
Okay, thanks, Jonathan, and thanks for Ben for organizing this. It's a pleasure. John Stuart Mill said the only way we can ever get to the truth is by hearing both sides in a polite way, and I'm sure based on my previous debates with Ben, that will ensue this time as well. Okay, so what is the case for laissez-faire capitalism? One of my favorite Thomas Sowell quotes, and I'm a big fan of Thomas Sowell, is, quote, "It is hard to imagine a more stupid or more dangerous way of making decisions than by putting those decisions in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong." So capitalism, if you make an error, you misunderstand what the consumer wants, you keep producing hula hoops when people don't want it anymore, or you're in a mom and pop grocery and the supermarket comes in, and namely you used to satisfy customers, but you no longer do, you automatically go out of business. When's the last time that any government entity, except for Donald Trump, forget about him for the moment, but when's the last time that a government entity ever went broke by screwing up? The FDA, Food and Drug Administration, screwed up on thalidomide. The centralized medical people screwed up on COVID. Did they go broke? No, they never go broke. They pay no price for being wrong. Whereas if McDonald's doesn't do the right thing and they give us a bad burger, or God forbid they kill people, there'll be no more McDonald's, and it'll be automatic. You don't have to pass any laws or anything like that. So capitalism is a system where if you make a mistake and you don't produce good things that the consumers want at a low price, you get outcompeted. And that's why we have a lot of good things. We have good shoes, we have good violins, we have good cars, we have good, I don't know what, computers, because if the people who are producing those things don't do it well, they get supplanted by other people. Whereas if the fire department or the library or the post office doesn't do a good job, well, that's it. They sort of stay there forever. Okay, so that's one point. Another point is that under capitalism, we consumers have much more control over producers than we as voters have over politicians who would be in charge of the socialist part of the economy. For example, how often is the dollar vote used? I don't know, every day, 3 times a day, 5 times a day, whenever people go shopping, whether to a grocery store or a pharmacy or online, they're voting dollars. When do we have a political vote? Well, every 4 years, maybe every 2 years. So the point is that if you want to have control at the bottom, if you want to have some sort of responsibility, the more often you can, I don't say crack the whip, but the more often you can register your pleasure or your displeasure, your thumbs up or your thumbs down, the better. And capitalism beats socialism or democracy hands down. The next one is focus. Suppose we just had an election between Kamala and Donald, and suppose I like Donald's programs 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, and I also like Kamala's programs 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. I have no way. I have to take a package deal. I can't say, well, I want one from column A and one from column B, and I like Kamala on this, and I want her to do that program, and I want Donald to do that. No. Whereas on the market, I could buy a violin, I could buy a motorcycle, I could buy I don't know, a chair, I could buy a frisbee. Namely, I can have a very narrow focus. Another one is rational ignorance. If I want to buy a motorcycle, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask some people who have motorcycles, well, which one's the good one? What should I watch out for? I'm going to go online and ask about this. I'm going to maybe go to Consumer Reports. I'm going to find out about motorcycles, and I'm going to know a bit about motorcycles. Because if I don't, then I'm not going to get a good motorcycle, and people have an incentive to be rational in the market. Do we have a incentive to be rational in the political sphere as well? No, because look, first of all, my vote is one of millions and it's not going to even have any effect. Secondly, I'm a dummy. I know nothing about anything and I just go by who smiles better. And somebody else is an expert, a total expert on everything political. And how many votes does that guy get? One, the same as me. So what you have is input of ignorance into the political system, whereas you have input into rationality into the market. Another benefit of capitalism vis-a-vis socialism is unanimity. Every time anyone acts in the market, there's unanimity. I bought this shirt, I don't know, $10. There was unanimous agreement. I agreed to buy it. The guy who sold it to me agreed to sell it to me. And there was perfect unanimity. And all the market consists of is voluntary trades. And in each and every voluntary trade, there's unanimity. Is there unanimity in the government sector? Are you kidding? I mean, Donald won, I don't know how many votes he got, maybe 49%, Kamala 48, something like that, or maybe he got 51, but there was no unanimity. In the market, you have unanimity, and in the political sphere, you don't. And surely unanimity is better than non-unanimity. There are two kinds of socialism. One is, well, actually, there are three. One is the ownership, the government ownership of all the means of production. And Ben doesn't favor that, so I'm not going to deliberate too much on that. But that's one type of socialism. Another type of socialism is from each according to his each, from each according to each, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That's another definition of socialism. And as long as that's done on a voluntary basis, that's okay. I'm a socialist. I'm sure Ben will be happy to know that in that sense, he and I are fellow socialists. I mean, the average family, when my little girl was 3 years old, she ate food in accordance, not with her ability to earn income, but in accordance with her ability, her need. So that's okay. And now there's another way of looking at it, and that is voluntary or coercive. Voluntary socialism would be the kibbutz or the commune or the family. And they could practice from each to each. And as long as it's voluntary, that's fine. But the kind of socialism, what do they call it? Democratic socialism that Ben is advocating is not voluntary socialism. It's coercive socialism. You're in the commune whether you like it or not. And I think that this is a violation of rights to tell people that they have to join. I'm not a joiner. I don't want to join the socialist commune. If socialism is so great, why don't the socialists just practice it among the people who agree to be part of it? Why do they compel other people like me to be part of it, even though we don't want to be part of it? I just want to mention a little bit about East Germany and West Germany. They were the same people, the same culture, the same history, the same IQ, the same ability, the same characteristics, same everything. And the same for North and South Korea. And due to an accident of war, East Germany went one way, West Germany went the other way. And at the end of this, people in East Germany were trying to leave, and they were being shot as they were leaving. Now, I know that Ben doesn't favor this. He favors the what do you call it? The Sweden and Norway. And I just have a book here. It's a Economic Freedom of the World. And those countries, the Scandinavian countries, are in the top 10% of economic freedom. So if he and Bernie Sanders favor that, just as I was a socialist before, they're really capitalists because these are among the most free countries, economically free countries in the world. And with that, my 10 minutes are up.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. So in accord with the format, I'm going to set the timer to 5 minutes and allow Ben a chance to respond to Walter's opening.
Ben, you have to turn your microphone on.
Yes,
That's
I do.
better.
All right. The first thing I want to point out is that Walter gave us a defense of markets, which is a different thing from a defense of capitalism. Markets existed for thousands of years before the rise of capitalism, and probably in any version of socialism that we know how to make work logistically at this point in history, we probably need market mechanisms for some things. But what makes something capitalism, socialism, feudalism, right? What makes it one economic system rather than another is who are the immediate producers, right? The people who are actually working, and how are they then related to whoever is controlling the means of production? Do you have capitalists and wage workers? Do you have lords and serfs? Do you have associations of workers who are collectively running the means of production? And a lot of what Walter is talking about with regards to how if the company that makes hula hoops makes bad hula hoops, the market punishes them, and this works so well that this is why we have good shoes, good violins, good cars, good computers. I would say a couple of things. So part of what he's latching onto is a real thing, right? This is the calculation problem that there's that right now, right, it's a very difficult problem about how centralized planning can coordinate, production with fine-grained consumer needs. But I would also say that the extent of that problem is an empirical question. It cannot be answered a priori. And in fact, we know, right, from extensive empirical observation over experiments that have taken place over decades and decades, we know that there are some things that can be quite effectively planned outside of the market. Healthcare, for example, where all of those countries that I mentioned earlier that have non-market healthcare systems do a much better job, that they have, like, by every ranking, for the World Health Organization, whatever you want, they have, those are more successful healthcare systems than ours are. They have lower rates of mortality amenable to healthcare, which is stats nerd speak for the rate of people who die if they lived, who would have lived if they had timely medical intervention. Similarly, Walter mentions, when he said, oh, if the fire department, the library, the post office don't do a good job, they just stay there forever. I think it shouldn't take a lot of imagination to see how much of a nightmare it would be to privatize any of those things. And I particularly point out that the U.S. Postal Service consistently ranks as one of the very most popular parts of the federal government for obvious reasons, right? You're not going to get a private company with the incentive to take a letter from, Southern California to rural Alaska for less than $1, right? That you need something that where you remove profit incentives to make that possible. I also want to address, because while I'm on the empirical point, I want to address this business about the Fraser Institute, those economic, freedom of the world rankings. I believe that is Fraser. So I actually wrote an article about this for Jacobin in 2021. I have a hyperlink to it in my last response to Walter in Marion West. But basically, I'm happy to get into this if we have, as we go on. But basically, I don't think the Fraser rankings meaningfully rank anything or are meaningful evidence of anything, except for how creative think tank hacks can be when their job is to put numbers into the blender again and again until they get the results that they want. I think if you find yourself saying, for example, that Norway and Sweden, which are full of exactly the kinds of programs that I support and Walter does not, right? Socialized healthcare, tuition-free higher education, et cetera, if you find yourself saying that, oh, those places are less socialist than, say, Haiti, which ranks as as much less economically free. On the Fraser rankings, something has gone horribly wrong. I think the results speak for themselves. At one point, the Fraser rankings actually said that Ukraine in 2005 was less economically free than it had been in 1980, which shows you that something is completely wacky about the Fraser methodology. This just does not show what they want to show. And finally, I want to point out that with all this business about voluntary socialism and involuntary socialism, Walter is doing exactly what I talked about in my opening statement, that he's talking about this as if non-interference did any heavy lifting in showing what the distribution could be, which it cannot for reasons that I got into.
Okay, thank you, Ben. So we will proceed to Walter for his 5-minute reply to Ben's reply.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, capitalism, laissez-faire capitalism, is the same thing as free enterprise or free markets. I use them as synonyms. I don't see any gigantic difference. As far as health insurance, Ben, why not allow, and this is a rhetorical question because it's my 5 minutes, why not allow those people that want to join, let them join? Why coerce other people to join when they don't want to join? This isn't freedom. Now I ask, why is it that medical expense is so expensive? And the answer is because of the institutions that Ben favors. The big part of GDP is labor. Labor accounts for some 70–75% of the GDP. The big part of medical expense is doctors' salaries. Why are doctors' salaries so high? In some of my research, what I did is I compared doctors' salaries with people who I thought could have been doctors had they been allowed into medical school, namely PhDs in chemistry or biology or something like that. And the ratio was something like 6-2. They make 6 times as much doctors as PhDs in biochem or something like that. And I assume biochem PhDs could have been doctors if they were let into medical school. But they're not let into medical schools because we have the AMA, which restricts entry. I have a cousin who's now a doctor, and the first year he applied after he graduated, he applied to 10 schools, he got into none. The next time he applied to every school in the country, he got into none, and he finally got his medical degree in Europe, and then he came back and had to have a big fight to get in. So this is one of the reasons why it's so expensive. And then we talk about the redistribution. Why should we take, that's just theft. Why should we, by the way, Ben, you have a nice head of hair. Take a look at me. I don't have too much. Shouldn't we go to Ben and grab some of his hair and put it into me if we could? Well, I don't think so, but that's the same thing. Ben's hair, he owns that hair. He also owns his eyeglasses. He owns his shirt. He owns his money. And if I come and grab it on the grounds that he's a little richer than someone else and I'm going to give it to someone else, I'm a thief. And thievery is not good. Pinochet. Milton Friedman went down there to Pinochet, not to support Pinochet, but to convert Pinochet to free enterprise. He also went to China to convert the Chinese to free. I mean, he was a Johnny One Note, and I mean this is a compliment. And his one note was free enterprise, and he was converting the Chinese commies and the Pinochet fascists. He didn't care. Convert everyone to freedom. And somehow lefties got on his case about Pinochet and never mentioned China. Look, every time that there's a commercial activity, both sides gain. I bought the shirt for $10. How much did I value the shirt when I bought it? More than 10, not equal to 10. There'd be no profit in it for me. The guy who sold it had many shirts and he valued it probably at $1. So there's mutual gain every time in the free enterprise system, whereas you can't say that with socialism. Some people gain, other people lose, and it's the devil's work to try to figure out whether the gains are greater than the losses. You can't figure it. Now, he mentions that the mortality rate is lower in places that have governmental health care. Is this because of that or in spite of that? That's a crucial question. I say it's in spite of the fact that they have that. That's why they're doing so well. Ben says it's because of, but he's got no evidence for that. Another point is, what have I got here? Oh, yeah, the worker control. Let's suppose that we're all workers and we live on this island. And what we do is we pick, I don't know, coconuts and pineapples. And the three of us are on the island and we each are separate. And now all of a sudden I go to Jonathan, I say, hey, Jonathan, come work for me and I'll pay you more. And we all collect 10 units of food every day. And I say, Jonathan, come work for me. I'll give you 11 units. How am I going to get the 11 units? Because when the two of us work together, we together can produce more than double each one of us. That's how I got rich, by creating something, whereas I didn't employ Ben, and Ben is an independent producer and he's poor. So.
Okay. Well, thank you, Walter. I suspect Ben wants to reply, and I would like to hear what Ben has to say, and then obviously what Walter will have to say and respond to that. So let's go with 3 minutes apiece, and then we'll proceed to a question that I'd like to ask.
Who goes first?
Yeah.
That will be Ben.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. So on health insurance, Walter insists that the fact that there are all of these other countries that have universal health care that are available to everybody, free at the point of service. So nobody in those societies is holding off on getting something checked out that could be cancer or it could be nothing, because they're afraid of how much they'd have to pay out of pocket because they don't have health insurance, or even they're afraid of the copay because they do have health insurance. That all of the good results in terms of mortality amenable to healthcare are a complete coincidence. And he says, I can't prove that it's not a coincidence. We can have some kind of human skepticism here about, basic procedures of evidence when we're ranking systems in different countries, in which case I would point out that, what's good for the goose is good for the gander, that in addition to the wacky results that I mentioned earlier, this would also be a problem with all those economic freedom rankings, right? How do you know that the good things in these societies are because they rank higher on economic freedom? Perhaps it's all a crazy coincidence. Perhaps, even East Germany's economic system, had nothing to do with why things were worse in East Germany. I think this is very silly. I also think that blaming the medical costs on the US being insufficiently laissez-faire sits very uncomfortably with the global evidence. The US already has one of the most laissez-faire healthcare systems in the world, certainly the most laissez-faire health system in the developed world, and it has spectacularly bad results. At this point, this just sounds like ideological dogma. But what I really want to focus on, because in the opening, I explained why saying, oh, redistribution is bad because it's theft, because it's coercion, is just blatantly begging the question. It's arguing in a circle. It's assuming the thing that you're trying to prove. That, because after all, what you have to mean is that it's wrong to interfere with property to which people are morally entitled, which is just a roundabout way of saying it's wrong because it's wrong. All this business about its theft, its aggression, this is just the philosophical equivalent of the street magician talking the entire time that he's doing his tricks. So you look at his face instead of looking at his hands. The heavy lifting is never being done by this principle about aggression or theft, right? The heavy lifting is always being done by the theory of property rights, the theory of who is in fact entitled to what. And that is what 100% of the real argument is about.
Okay, so before we proceed to a question, Walter, you have an opportunity to respond.
I just wanted to finish my point about worker control. The reason workers can't get control is because I own the company. I built it up by making voluntary trades with people, and I'm Bill Gates, and I am very, very rich. How did I get rich? I made better computers. And this idea of democracy, economic democracy, is just theft. This idea of it's a circular argument, no. Remember, every time that there's a commercial activity interaction, there's mutual benefit ex ante, not ex post always. Sometimes after the effect, people regret their decision. But ex ante, there's always benefit, a mutual benefit. And the socialists can't say anything like that at all. Then there's the post office. You can't privatize the post office. Well, we had private post offices. Wells Fargo and Pony Express and what's that one that delivers packages? I forget the name of it. We've had private companies deliver, and whenever they deliver, they do it at a much lower cost. Ben makes much of the case that medical service is free at the point of service. True. But what does that mean? If you take a basic supply and demand curve, and you put in free, the demand is greater than the supply. If it costs me something, I might consider, well, should I go to the doctor or not? But if it's free and I'm lonely and I need to speak to somebody and the doctor will speak to me, I'll go in there. So what the Fraser Institute does, and I used to be a part of it, and I uphold their analysis of countries. But now I'm talking about something different. What they do is they measure waiting times. And there was this lovely case where a woman and her horse both had the same problem, a kidney problem. And the woman went to the doctor to fix her kidney, and it took, I don't know, 18 months to get fixed. And they took the horse to a vet to get the horse's kidney fixed, and they did it right away, well, within a day or so. And the point is that if they didn't do it right away, she would have been put in jail for animal cruelty. Well, this is human cruelty. So again, I asked Ben, if you think that this program is so great, why compel everyone to join it? Why not just take all of you guys and say, okay, we're going to have socialized medicine. You can't come, but we're going to have socialized medicine, and you'll get free this and free that, and everything will be hunky-dory. Why do you insist on compelling people who don't want to join? I mean, it just seems like, well, highly problematic. Public education. I'll talk about public education next time.
Okay, so at this point, I'd like to ask a question. The point is to ask a question for each of you. The first one will be to Ben, so it'll be a question that I guess in some sense challenges his argument. And I'm going to set it to 5 minutes. And the question is, Amazon comes up in your essay, and you've mentioned it tonight, and this kind of feeds into one of the points that Walter was just making. I think that we can all appreciate the sense of more democratic participation in an Amazon warehouse, the kind of worker cooperative argument. But the idea of nationalizing Amazon, or say some other company or what have you, kind of going all the way with socialism. It seems to me that this brings us to a very basic point about property rights from the standpoint of an economist, and at least, without getting into the philosophy, mixing your labor and all that property rights is meant as a kind of incentive. And so we can go back to 1994, whenever it was, Ben Bezos is conceiving his idea for the company, and goes on to build this great company. But then back then he thinks to himself, well, 30 years from now, the company is going to nationalize my company, so why should I even bother? And it seems like that would be a real problem with just the basic incentive for innovation in an economy. And I can think of ways of addressing that, but that would be me answering the question rather than you. So I'll let you kind of take that over.
Is there a time clock for this?
Yep.
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple of different questions inside that question. So this is because one of them is a question about instability and expectations that, if we transition from one system to another, that expectations that people formed under the previous system, won't hold anymore. That they'll be told that these were the rules, and if you play by this rule, then you'll be rewarded in the future, and then the rules change, right? And of course, that's going to be true. That's going to be trivially true anytime that you have a change of systems. I think that we agree, though, that some change of systems were good, right? That slave owners who invested lots of resources in plantations, having the rules changed on them, for example, was a good thing, right? So, of course, obviously you want a new system that will then be stable going forward, right? But if you put a lot of weight and you can't have instability and defeated expectations, then you just end up saying that whatever the status quo happens to be at whatever part of history you've landed on just has to stay that way forever. Right. So that's one thing. The other thing is an alternate defense of property rights. So as I said earlier, the attempt to defend property rights based on non-coercion, or the idea that redistribution is theft, is simply circular. It doesn't work. All of the heavy lifting, right? Because you're never saying people are entitled to what they have a legal right to, because then nationalization would be fine. You're not saying they're entitled to what they happen to be currently in possession of, or else even recovered stolen property, would be a problem. You're always saying they're entitled to, they're entitled to what they have a moral claim on, which is just a way of saying that they're entitled to what they're entitled to. All of the work is always being done by the substantive theory of who is entitled to what resources. Talking about non-aggression or redistribution being theft is always a red herring. It's always circular. Okay, but this is a pragmatic defense of it, that we need the right to private property, not just the kind of private property that both capitalist and socialist theories of entitlement are going to agree on, right? Your right to your person, your personal possessions, your glasses, your shirt, whatever, but the right to private property, the means of production. That we need that to provide incentives for innovation. And that is an empirical question. And I would point out, right, Walter said earlier, Bill Gates got rich through the free market. Well, not really, right? Because by his lights, we don't have a free market, right? We have the only thing we've ever had is a market that's heavily propped up, right? Certainly in any kind of complex, thriving market economy, a market that's heavily propped up by all sorts of state intervention, going from enforcement of intellectual property to fiat currency, without which it would be impossible to have a stable functioning economy, through all sorts of mechanisms to prop up private enterprise, very much included in innovation. Right. So the only TED Talk I ever recommend that people watch, generally I find those annoying, is Mariana Mazzucato's. She wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State. And one of the things she does in this talk is she'll hold up an iPhone and say, let's talk about all of the components of this that make it a smartphone, not a dumb phone. So that would be the touchscreen technology, the GPS, the internet itself, all of these things. None of them were a result of private sector innovation. All of them were developed in the public sector, in the Department of Defense, in public universities, in labs with federal funding. So I think, as an empirical matter, the idea that innovation in technology has to happen within the private sector is just not true. Now, could it be true that you need some of it to happen there? That even though the public sector in practice does quite a bit of the heavy lifting, and we probably would not have these things I just mentioned without it, that some of it needs to be done in the private sector. If so, then I would say, like the calculation problem, that might give you a reason to say, okay, we can make the things public that we know from experience, from empirical testing, the public sector is good at. If we still need a real market sector for some things, this can at least be a market sector of worker-owned firms like Mondragon in Spain, which I mentioned earlier, which in fact does a fair amount of technological innovation.
Okay, thank you. And Walter, you have an opportunity to respond.
Okay, thank you. Ben says that without fiat currency, we'd be up the creek without a paddle. I'm putting words in his mouth, but that was the gist of what he said. Well, we had the gold standard for many years, and we weren't up the creek. I would say that the reason we had the Great Depression was because of the fiat currency. Look, the government takes half the GDP. It would be amazing if they never did anything good. So I accept that Ben's point about, well, they made some contributions to high tech, but this is nothing to write home about. It'd be amazing with half the GDP if they never did anything decent. So they did some stuff decent, and I acknowledge that. Public education. The reason we had public education, it was an attack on Catholics by Protestants. What happened in the 1870s, 1880s, when public schools started, and before we had public schools in the late 19th century, we still had education. The problem was that the Protestants didn't much like these Catholics having Catholic schools because they were teaching popery and other evil things. But they weren't powerful enough to prohibit it. So what they did, they were very smart. They said, let's have private schools and we'll tax the Catholics for it. So the Catholics will have to pay twice, once for their own private schools and once for our schools through taxes. So private schools started out not very nicely. What are they like now? They try to get 12-year-old kids to change their sex without telling the parents. And when the parents object to this in a meeting, then they call them terrorists, and they teach them DEI and stuff like that. Why can't we have private schools? Some of the best schools are Catholic schools, and they teach everybody, and I don't see any big problem with that. So I'm not a big fan of public schools. Prices are very important. If we don't have prices, we're at sea without a rudder, or up the creek without a paddle, or whatever you want to say. And to the extent that we have government intervention, we don't have prices that tell us anything. When you give stuff away for free, you get, as I was mentioning, the woman with the horse, and they both had kidney problems. There's a gigantic waiting list, and this is something that the Fraser Institute has done very well. They've listed how long does it take to get service, and Canada is one of the places that Ben talks about as a great idea. Whenever you give something away for free, demand is greater than supply, because supply and demand is like a cross, and at the bottom, demand is greater than supply. So people will go to a doctor for frivolous reasons, whereas if they had to pay something, and they would pay a lot less if there were more doctors allowed, and they're not allowed. And this idea of circularity, I just don't get that idea of circularity. Look, I'm now the employer, and Jonathan and Ben are my employees. What am I contributing to the enterprise? Well, one thing I'm contributing to the enterprise is, and we're going to make pens like this. And how long is it going to take for the first pen to come off the assembly line? 1 year, let's say. Well, what are we going to do for salary for that 1 year? I'm going to pay you guys a salary for that 1 year. You could have gone off on your own, you two employees of mine. You could have set up your workers' co-op, but you didn't have the money, and you didn't want to do it. And also risk. Now, I paid you a year's salary, and guess what? Nobody wants these pens. Do I now come back to you and I say, hey, I got bad news for you. Give me back the salary that I paid you for a year. No, I'm the risk bearer. If the pens sell, I'm the claimant, residual claimant. And if they don't sell, I bear the risk. So look, this idea of workers' co-ops and economic democracy, yes, if you guys want to do it, go do it. Nobody's stopping you. You can have workers' co-ops or whatever you want. Nobody is stopping you. And look, the reason that I got rich when I first hired Jonathan for 11 coconuts instead of the 10 that we all got is because I had some entrepreneurship going on. That's how I got rich. If we had this situation where everyone was equal and some people started employing others, it was a voluntary thing and the employers got rich. So I don't see any circularity here at all.
Okay, let's do one more back and forth with 3 minutes apiece. We're about 10 minutes away from an hour. like to get a second question in, but and if so, maybe on the back and forth, we'll go down maybe to 2 minutes, but we'll just see. But for now, let's do 3 minutes apiece to reply to each other.
Who goes first?
Yeah.
Ben, just because he's replying to you right now.
Okay.
Yeah. The inference from micro level individual transactions, A agrees to make pens for B, right? C buys B's pens. The inference from that being mutually advantageous to all participants in the moment to the conclusion that macro level social arrangements that emerge from all this must be in the interests of the majority of the population, never mind the entire population, pretty blatantly commits the composition fallacy. It's like moving from the premise that all the individual molecules in the Brooklyn Bridge are invisible to the naked eye to the conclusion that a bridge itself is invisible. An example that I used in my last reply to Walter at Marion West is, if we didn't have sexual harassment laws, the secretary who takes a job where she has to put up with the groping attentions of her boss to keep her position is making a decision more to her advantage than being thrown into unemployment, especially if she lives in an anarcho-capitalist society with no unemployment benefits. Nevertheless, laws against private sector sexual harassment are pretty clearly in the interests of secretaries. So it doesn't follow at all from the fact that, yes, given the total circumstances somebody is in at a particular moment, that it's more advantageous for them to engage in a market transaction than to not engage from it. It doesn't follow from that therefore, whatever emerges from all these transactions is in the interests of most people, right? So one of the things that Walter said earlier was that we get to vote with our dollars so much more often than we get to vote in the ballot box. True enough. Of course, some of us have a lot more votes than others in that case, but also even when it comes to the voting with our dollars that we all do get to do, because those things are a package deal too, right? It's not just, do I want, for example, people at, do I want people to be paid over $15 an hour, for example, so I'm going to buy this cereal rather than that cereal because the producers of it make over $15 an hour. No, it's a package deal with the taste of the cereal and how much it costs and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, which is why you have all these states where you've never gotten $15 an hour through voting through your dollar, but you do get it through popular referendums. Really quickly on Canada, I would just say that that Canadian healthcare has much better outcomes than American healthcare. Overall, we have, there's a reason why even conservative politicians in Canada can't run on a platform of getting rid of it. They would never win another election. And the last thing, I know it's going to start making its music, but just let me finish this sentence, is that I just want to point out that it's nothing to brag about if you have shorter lines, not because you hire more doctors, but because you kicked people out of line for not being able to pay. I think that's a moral disgrace.
Okay, I'm going to give you, Walter, 15 extra seconds. And you can reply now.
Ben mentions unemployment. Why do we have unemployment? Mainly because of the minimum wage law. Most people think minimum wage law is sort of a law that raises wages. The higher it is, the more wages. Well, if so, why not make it $1 million a year and we'd all be rich? We could stop foreign aid and just tell these poor countries, hey, put in a minimum wage, you'll be rich. Before the advent of the minimum wage, the unemployment rate of white and black was about the same. The unemployment rate of older people and teenagers about the same. Nowadays, the unemployment rate of black teens is quadruple the unemployment rate of white middle-aged people. Why? Because the minimum wage is not a floor that raises wages. It's a barrier over which you have to jump. And the higher it is, the harder it is to get over it. And this is part and part. Bernie Sanders loves the minimum wage and he wants to raise it to $20. Well, if my productivity is $15 an hour and the minimum wage law is $20, anyone who hires me is going to lose $5 an hour. Now, this idea of taking money away from rich people and giving it to poor people, I try to grab some of Ben's hair. He wasn't donating any of it, and I could use it. And he's got, look at how much he's got. Not fair. Look, you take away money from the rich guy, and he's got less of an incentive to be rich. You give money to a poor guy, and he's got more incentive to be poor. This is not the way to run a railroad. This is not the way to run an economy. This is not the way to have prosperity. Now, with the sexual harassment business, we're getting into prostitution now. Look, what determines wages in the first place? What determines wages is productivity. My productivity, I can pick apples at $40 an hour. My wage will tend to be 40 an hour. Jonathan can pick apples at 50 an hour. His wage will tend to be 50. Why will my wage tend to be 50? Because if it's 55, they'll lose money on hiring me. And if it's 45, someone else will hire me at 46. So wages tend to equal productivity. So when Jonathan mentions sexual productivity, we're now talking about prostitution. Namely, a person who's a secretary part-time and a prostitute part-time. They make a lot of money. Ben is giving the impression that they're desperate and they have to use sex much against their will. But why are they unemployed in the first place? Why are they so desperate in the first place? Not because of capitalism, not because of free enterprise, but because of government interferences with the free enterprise system. If there were no minimum wage law, something that is just beloved of all Democratic Socialists, Bernie Sanders, my old buddy, really loves it. This has played havoc with the people who can least afford to be unemployed. So Ben is trying to give us a little pity party for the poor, unfortunate woman that's so desperate that she can't get another job that she has to adhere to sexual harassment. But it all stems from the problem from the.
Okay, thank you, Walter. I want to proceed to a question that I now have for Walter. And I guess Walter can go first on this. This may be a question that, kind of as Ben says, has several questions in it, but it gets to the sense that I'm picking up here that Walter is arguing more in the way of principles, and Ben is trying to focus on sort of empirical issues. The question is, one of the reasons I do this thing at night is because, like many of us, I have a day job, and that day job for me is I work in the government. And despite what Elon Musk would say about lower productivity workers, I work for an agency that's actually quite widely respected by left, right, and everybody. It's EIA, Energy Statistics and Analysis. So basically, information is a public good. So it's one of the few agencies that doesn't really have any political enemies right now. Now, I mention that because we're obviously going through a time now in which Musk is essentially trying to slash the government, and hopefully I will escape that. I do have very high performance ratings and so on. I will say that I am in the fossil fuels analyst. I've written anti-woke books. The point being that I'm not like some lefty ideologue in the government that, they have to root out of the government and so on. So hopefully I'll turn out okay. But where I'm going with this is the question of luck. So I don't really like to talk about it because, I don't like to claim the mantle of victim, but I'll just let you know that I have brain cancer, particularly a brain tumor, and it's been manageable for 8 years now. Mainly because it's not a glioblastoma yet anyway. And I have a great team at Johns Hopkins. They manage it. Hopefully they can continue to manage it because I have a very good healthcare plan as an employee of the federal government. And like I say, I think I provide a good service to the public. But let's just say that by sheer bad luck, I get the hammer from our great entrepreneur, Elon Musk. And, you mentioned some of your articles about saving, about being entrepreneurial. I've certainly tried to do all of that in my life. Didn't necessarily start off with wealth at all. I've actually lived in a shelter when I was a kid. I, working class background, so on. So, but I've tried to, I've voted Republican and so on in the past. So basically, I've tried to toe that line. But just by sheer luck, I could find myself in a position without health insurance and without income. And you could say, okay, well, I'll get another job. But it just so happens also that I might be facing another brain surgery this year. In fact, very likely, given developments in my scan. And then they want to put me on a therapy that might, basically allow me to kind of preserve my life and a little bit longer and so on. And of course, that all goes away without health insurance. And as you know, as an economist, we can talk about transactions, mutual beneficial transactions, but there are such things as transaction costs, search costs, negotiation costs, enforcement costs. So it's not so easy to just go get another job. And finally, I'll just mention that it might not be a surprise that brain cancer has a lot of side effects, one of which for me is sleep disruption, chronic, and so on and so forth, which requires a lot of adjustments throughout the day. So remote work happens to be a very good accommodation for me, so on and so forth. Sorry to go into a little personal soapbox, but I thought it might dramatize the question that, sure, in a part market system, there's a lot of free, it's about free transactions, according to price discovery, and so on. But in a laissez-faire system or capitalist system or whatever, it seems that the response that perspective has to my situation is, well, tough luck. Is that the case?
Jonathan, I'm shocked and dismayed with your story. I didn't realize that you had this medical problem. And
well, I don't like to talk about it too much, but given the situation, I feel compelled.
That's okay, and I'm sure Ben joins me in wishing you the best of health and full recovery. Ben and I don't agree on much, but I'm sure we agree on that.
Thank you.
Let me respond to you in the order of the points you made. You're providing information. And you say, I provide a good service. Well, how do you know? Nobody volunteer. Is the clock on for me now?
So let me just say, Let me just say that Project 2025, which is the blueprint for the GOP, specifically describes EIA as not a problematic agency, provides independent, impartial analysis, is widely respected, and is widely used by many stakeholders, including people in Congress, the business community. So their own blueprint has good things to say about that industry based on their understanding of the stakeholders involved.
Would you put me back up to 5 minutes?
Sure thing. Yes.
Okay, great.
There we go.
Sorry.
We're
24.
There we go.
Murray Rothbard wrote an essay called Statistics, the Achilles heel of Government. And he wanted to ban all governmental informational generating institutions such as your own. And I agree with him entirely. Without these statistics, we'd have a lot less central planning, and central planning is a very bad thing. We should have planning from the bottom up for the market. You say, by the way, there is private generation of statistics or private generation of information, Consumer Reports. Every newspaper is providing information. There are private sources of information, and the benefit of a private source of information is that they can go broke if the consumers don't like it, whereas your institution can't go broke unless Donald shapes up and wants to get rid of your group as well. And I favor not getting rid of your group, privatizing it. And if it's so good, then somebody should be willing to pay for the service, just like we pay for Consumer Report, or we pay for the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal which also provide information. You say, I provide a good service. You have no proof of that. just because a bunch of bureaucrats in Washington under Donald Trump say that you do, I don't know. No cash was put on the barrelhead and say, yes, I want that service and I'm willing to pay for it. Rather, your salary comes through taxes, and taxes are compulsory. And again, if people want this service, let them buy it. I keep asking Ben if medical insurance or medical coverage is so great. If his program is so great, but why doesn't he content himself with doing it on a voluntary basis? Why does he have to draft people? He talks about slavery. Why does he have to enslave us into this system? And Jonathan, I say the same thing to you. Why should you get away with compelling me to pay taxes to pay for your salary? It's unjust. Now, with regard to your medical situation, I did mention that a big part of medical expenses are doctor's salaries, and that doctor's salaries are up into the stratosphere. And why is that? Because whenever supply shifts to the left, prices go up. And the AMA has shifted those supply curves way to the left. And also, here's another program, beloved of Ben, DEI, or affirmative action. Those people at Johns Hopkins, half of them don't belong there. Half of them, well, I don't know about half, but some of them don't belong there because they're only there because of affirmative action. And if it weren't for affirmative action, the people at Johns Hopkins would be a hell of a lot better, and they might have already cured you. Now, I have to make another point. I favor privatizing school buses. School buses shouldn't be private. Sorry, I'm under Ben's influence here. Shouldn't be public. Stop that, Ben. I'm kidding, of course. How should this work? Here's a school bus full of kids, and now it's in the middle of, I don't know, Montana in the winter. And what happens is that the bus driver gets the word that school buses are no longer public. And you know what this illegitimate person does? He gets out of there and he leaves all the kids to freeze to death. Is that any way to have privatization? No. It's a transition period. In other words, what your plight is due to Jonathan's plight is due to Ben's policies. And now all of a sudden we have Jonathan has a problem, and he wants instantaneous solution. Well, you're not going to get any instantaneous solution. It takes a while to privatize and have the benefits of many more doctors and doctors who belong there. Nowadays in medical school, you know what they're doing? They're having DEI in medical school, and they're having even for airline pilots, for God's sakes. Well, this is a policy that Ben favors too, if I understand him, although he hasn't mentioned this. This is death. So, Jonathan, you would be much better off if in the past 20 years we had free enterprise. You'd have better doctors at a lower price than now. And it's very unfair against the capitalist system to say, well, here I am bereft. I'm like a school child left in the cold because all of a sudden privatization was like that and we left people in the lurch. No, the way you privatize is you have to have a transition period. You don't just say, well, this all ends. Even Donald is having a bit of a transition.
Okay. Thank you, Walter. I will transition over to Ben for a reply. Oh, mute.
There we go. So the original question was about luck. And that, strikes me as a really serious, morally weighty reason to object to a given distribution. In fact, when Walter is defending capitalist property rights, you'll notice that he does it by talking about the things that he thinks that capitalists have done in order to merit having this, right? That they took all these risks, they innovated. And one point that you could make about that certainly is that Walter says that he doesn't understand the idea that it's circular, to say that it's wrong to take away the things that people are morally entitled to, but that really what's doing all the heavy lifting is the underlying theory of entitlement. But then when challenged on that point, he doesn't just defend himself in terms of freedom from interference, which is completely vacuous, right? He he defends himself on the grounds of that no, there's this substantive reason why these people deserve it, because because they were risk takers, that they haven't taken a risk at one time, right? They deserve to reap the benefits at another time. Now, I would point out that the main risk they were taking was falling into the working class and thus being, down to the position of the people who, you're saying shouldn't have a say in what goes on in the workplaces where they have to spend half their lives. But that is a slightly different question. I would just point out that if you're going to have this kind of merit-based argument in defense of capitalist property rights, which is mostly, surprisingly, what I've heard, given my previous knowledge of Walter and his attachment to these deontic kind of Lockean arguments, it's going to be this issue about luck that Jonathan is raising is going to be a huge problem, right? Because it is very evidently, very often completely beyond the control of the person who gets the short end of the stick in any number of ways, right? People don't choose whether to be born into a family where you can be sent to a nice private school and have SAT tutors, or born into a poor family. People don't choose whether they're going to have the particular package of dispositions and talents that might help some people climb through ladders of class mobility, although structurally it's going to be impossible for everybody to do that, etc. So I think that that matters a lot, right? But of course, so that's an equality concern, that it's bad to have inequality where the people with the short end of the stick don't have any control over what leads them to have the short end of the stick. But there's also a question, right? I mean, I talked about three values in the opening, right? So there's also a question about freedom. And Walter has said several times, oh, you want to enslave people into universal health care, meaning that they have to pay taxes to support it, even if they would rather not. And I would say, so it's like, why do that? Why not just have, mutual aid societies or something like that? Well, I would say that the empirical results are in, right? We know that one of these things works and one of them does not work. I would also say that even if you went further than Walter would even be willing to and had a public option, right, but also private health insurance, that is a formula for two-tiered healthcare for the rich and the poor. That you are, as is always the case in arrangements like that, you're going to have doctors, you're going to have clinics who won't take the public plan, which Walter will celebrate as an exercise of their freedom, but I think is a very ugly kind of society to end up with at the end. As far as doctors' salaries being in the stratosphere, he'll be happy to know that they're lower in countries with socialized medicine, I think for fairly straightforward reasons, given having a single payer, who can dictate price points. But nevertheless, right, lots of people in those societies still want to be doctors. And the stuff about affirmative action, I think, is a very strange non sequitur, but I'm running out of time, so I will just say, Jonathan, for whatever very little it's worth, thinking about you. So I'm really sorry to hear all of this.
Yeah, so thank you for both your concerns. I guess it speaks for itself. But let us try to do one back and forth at 3 minutes apiece. I'll just note that this would take us to an hour and 20 minutes. And so that would leave 5-minute closing arguments, takes us to an hour and a half. If you wish, I can ask another question, but that doesn't have to happen because we are going to be at an hour and a half. So very happy to leave you guys to a 3-minute reply to each other here, and then closing arguments.
Yeah, that's fine with me.
Right. So Walter reply to Ben, and then Ben can reply to Walter, and then closing remarks.
Ben doesn't like a two-tiered health system. Well, we have a two-tiered car system. The rich people get a Mazda or a Toyota or something like that. The rich people get steak and I don't know, shrimp, and the poor people get a hamburger. Nothing wrong with a two-tiered any kind of a system. One of my favorite points is brought up by Robert Nozick, a famous libertarian philosopher, and it's the Wilt Chamberlain example. And he assumes everyone has exactly the same income. We all have the same income, no difference in income, and this is the egalitarian's goal. And now it's been achieved. And what Wilt Chamberlain, the rotten kid, does is he says, hey, anyone want to come watch me dunk a basketball? $20. And you know what happens? 1 million people come and they want to watch him play basketball or dunk a basketball or whatever it is. And at the end of the exercise, he's got, well, I guess $20 times 1 million people. He's got 20 million. And we all have $20 less. Now, it's true that we both gained. He certainly gained as he values the 20 million more than the loss of leisure, although he enjoys dunking a basketball. And we gain because we value the sight of him dunking the basketball more than $20. So there was mutual gain. But he's now very rich and we're very poor. So the only way to keep with egalitarianism is either to forbid him from doing this. Hey, Will, you just can't offer people $20 to watch you play basketball. Who do you think you are? Or we have to make him give back the money. And if we make him give back the money, he's not going to do it in the first place. Well, he might, but the odds are he won't, or especially if it's not dunking a basketball, but something he doesn't really enjoy doing that much. The point is that egalitarianism is sort of a problem. Let me just put it that way. It's a problem, and the egalitarians don't realize that it's necessarily a violation of rights. Now, Ben is going to say, well, this is circular on my part. I don't see how it's so circular. And then he says he doesn't want to have voluntary health care because it doesn't work. Well, that just shows that the system is no good. If the system doesn't work, I mean, if the socialized medicine is so great, let the people who want it do it, and if that doesn't work, well then.
Okay. And then Ben has 3 minutes to reply, and then we will proceed to closing statements. Mute.
Okay. So as luck would have it, I wrote about the Wilt Chamberlain argument for Jacobin in December. It's called How Capitalism Undermines Freedom. Anybody who wants to check that out. The basis of what I'm talking about is the classic refutation of Nozick on the Wilt Chamberlain argument, which comes from a 1977 paper by the late socialist analytic philosopher G.A. Cohen called How Patterns Preserve Liberty. Robert Nozick and the Wilt Chamberlain argument, or something like that. Definitely the first part is correct. I think that Nozick is essentially, and people can check that out if they want all the nuances of the argument, but I think that that Nozick is essentially sneaking his conclusion in through the back door, because he's purporting to be arguing from the egalitarian's premise that that's like, oh, we'll just assume that your egalitarian theory of justice is correct, and then when when all of this happens, surely we would all agree, right, that that Chamberlain should get to keep every bit of it, but the surely we would all agree is based on a theory of justice that says that a just distribution is whatever results from the right origins, from just steps, that all the steps are correct. But of course, that's the issue in dispute between egalitarian and libertarian theories of justice, whether what matters is whether you arrive at the outcome with the right steps, or whether the character of the outcome itself matters. Now, there are various substantive theories of egalitarianism. I'm very sympathetic to what I mentioned earlier, which is luck egalitarianism, which says that inequalities are objectionable. all else being equal, to the extent that they're outside of the control of whoever ends up with the short end of the stick. And I'm perfectly willing to say that has to be balanced against other considerations, even considerations about utility and economic efficiency. But I think even after all of the balancing has gone by, if you live in a society that is so absurdly unequal that some people are making hundreds of times what others are making, that some people own their own spaceships, some people die trying to ration out insulin, I think that is really morally indefensible. And I really don't have time to say the next thing, but we're about to go into closing statements anyway, so I'll just wait for that. Yep.
Okay, so now we go to closing arguments, starting with Ben.
Yeah, so there's a scene in the Christopher Nolan movie Oppenheimer, for anybody who's seen that, where the title character, this is taking place during World War II, leading up to the Manhattan Project, and the title character is talking to one of his colleagues, and he very excitedly shows him through a bunch of mathematical equations on the board his argument that in fact it is impossible to split atoms, that it cannot happen, which we can show a priori. And he finishes scribbling out all of his equations, and then his colleague says, "Yeah, we just split one in the lab next door," right? And I really can't help but think about that when I hear some of what Walter has to say about issues like the minimum wage and issues like healthcare, because we've run these experiments, and the a priori results that Walter is so committed to simply don't line up with what's happened in the actual world. Could you raise the minimum wage to $1 million without crashing the economy? No, you could not. Does that mean that any minimum wage increase would have net negative effects? Clearly not. So we can look at this. This is one of the most empirically studied issues in economics. We have decades and decades of minimum wage research, and if you do what libertarians often do and just cherry pick the small scale studies they like the best, you can find convergence with the a priori expectation about what you're going to find. But if you look at the meta studies, where you look at a bunch of studies that have been done on this question over the last several decades, the idea that there's going to be any sort of dramatic unemployment increase from even fairly significant minimum wage increases, such as what's going on when you had much lower minimum wages and you increase it to $15 an hour, just doesn't pan out in practice. We've run the experiment and it doesn't happen. And people have endless methodological arguments about this, that, oh, there's this problem with this study, there's that problem with that study. But I would say that even if they're right, the unemployment effects that they're talking about must not be very dramatic if it's this easy for them not to show up in the numbers, right? So I think that that's just not true. Similarly, with healthcare, like, we have seen what happens with socialized healthcare versus American style healthcare. Again, the results are in. There is a reason why even right-wing parties in countries like Canada or the UK or Norway or Sweden don't run on a platform of privatizing healthcare. They would never win again. The results speak for themselves. I also think this idea that it's slavery to tax people to pay for health insurance is, I think, it really reveals a concept of what kind of freedom matters the most that has gone horribly wrong. right? If you think about the kinds of freedom that actually matter in meaningful ways in people's lives, right? Then that's, do I quit this job so I can, I can write that novel I've always wanted to write? Do I try moving to this other city that I've always wanted to live in? Do I try to get to start this other career, right? These are all things that people are much less able to do because their jobs are tied to their healthcare. And I think this is a kind of freedom that is vastly more important in practice than the freedom to decide whether you have Aetna or Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's certainly a kind of freedom that's going to be much more important to most human beings. I know this is a very small part of the overall question about capitalism and socialism, but I think, as I am at the end of my time, the part is going to have to stand in for the whole.
Okay, thank you, Ben. And we will proceed to the final segment, Walter's closing statement.
I don't really think it's slavery to make people pay taxes. I think we have to distinguish between vicious, evil slavery and taxation, which is nowhere near as evil as slavery. Ben never answered the horse kidney and the woman's kidney problem. There is no universal health care in Canada for horses, and yet the horse got treated the very next day. The woman was given some palliative medicine, and for a year and a half, she suffered with that problem. When I was working for the Fraser Institute, living in Vancouver, my son had a friend, and his friend, they were both about 10 years old, and my son's friend's father was from Korea. And guess what he did in Korea? He was a doctor. And guess what he did in Canada? He serviced washing machines or some stupid thing like that. Why couldn't he get a medical license in Canada? Because his English wasn't that good. He had to pass the test in English. If he would have had the test in Korean, I assume he would have passed it because he was a doctor in Korea. And the argument from not the AMA, the CMA, the Canadian Medical Association was, well, suppose somebody comes into his office and says, my foot hurts, and he starts grabbing the guy's elbow. So you have to have the same language, which is nonsense. Because first of all, they're unconscious patients, and no language is relevant. Secondly, he could deal with Korean patients better than anyone else. And thirdly, they're translators. So the whole idea is to restrict entry to keep the prices up. Ben is correct. When you raise the minimum wage from $12 to $15, you don't get a real gigantic boost in unemployment, because it's only the people whose productivity between 12 and 15 are going to be unemployed. All the people whose productivity is lower than 12 are already unemployed. That's why the unemployment rate of Black teens is quadruple the unemployment rate of middle-aged white people. It's the most vicious, depraved law ever. And to say that you don't have big effects from a raise is true if the raise is small enough. If they raised it from 15 to 30, then everyone whose productivity from 15 to 30 would be unemployed pretty soon. And then you would have an appreciable effect. But if you just raise it in little dribs and drabs, each time you don't get much of an effect. You get a little effect and it adds. And that's why we have so much unemployment. The hell with privatizing libraries and museums and schools. I want to do a little bit more radical stuff. One of my books is why we should privatize roads, streets, and highways. How many people die on the nation's roads, streets, and highways? Around 40,000. How many people died from Katrina? How many people died from 9/11? 1,900 and 3,000. And it was a one-shot deal. How many people died in October 7th? Just 1,200. How many people died? This is 40,000 people every year. Why is it? It's because the goddamn government runs the roads, and it makes the rules of the roads, and it can't go broke whenever it screws up. Because as Thomas Sowell says, you don't pay any penalty for messing around. Now look, right now, the rule on the highway, I'm in New Orleans, the I-10 goes right by us. You have to do a minimum of 40 and a maximum of 70. Would it save lives if in the right lane everyone had to do 55, and in the middle lane everyone had to do 70, and in the left lane everyone had to do 85. Would it save lives? We don't know, because no one else can try that. Now, I'm going to try that on my road, and Ben is going to do, instead of that, he's going to try 60, 75, and 90. And Jonathan's road is going to try something else. And then we will learn which rules of the road lead to saving lives. Now, this thing about G.A. Cohen and ruining somehow Robert Nozick's excellent point about Wilt Chamberlain, I don't think so. The point is that Nozick is starting out with absolute egalitarianism, Ben's goal, and then he's saying that poor Wilt Chamberlain can't offer anyone anything to do anything. It's just night and day, and again, I thank you two for being part of this program.
Okay, thank you, Ben, and thank you, Walter, for a very stimulating, spirited debate about the case for socialism or capitalism. And with that, we will close out, I guess, our show.
Thank you for tuning in to this 22nd episode of the Escaping Ideology podcast series, where we try to engage in independent thought, critical commentary, and in-depth interviews from across the political spectrum, and not to mention the occasional debate, as in this case. I hope you enjoyed this debate between Ben and Walter on whether socialism or capitalism offers a better way of life. Finally, and as always, for more content from Marion West, including essays, interviews, op-eds, and the arts, as well as links to our podcast episodes, visit www.marionwest.com. Thank you, and until next time.
You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.